of the primary tenets that we believe in is that everybody has what they call Buddha nature in the respect of each and every person. So we tend to favor nonviolence in all interactions, private and professional. I'm also here in my capacity as the president of the Buddhist Council of New York. The Buddhist Council of New York is a group of about 70 or 80 lay and monastic Buddhist organizations that have come together to promote Buddhism. So I'm so glad that you're here on this very important day. We have these wonderful speakers. So what we wanted to do at the beginning is to ring the bell, since the position is just to ring the bell and have a few moments of silence so we can sort of center ourselves in an idea of compassion and caring on this very important topic. So I'm going to walk over there and ring the bell. I'd like to now introduce Ms. Wing T, the board member of the UNA of the USA of the Southern District of New York. Wing? Yeah, that's looking at you. Sorry. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Happy Monday. I think I do need it. Yeah, what a beautiful temple, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you very much for James Lee, the director of Rissho Kosei-Kai, and also thank you for Buddhist Action Coalition and the volunteers for this wonderful arrangement. I'm Wing Zhang, board member of the UN Associations of the United States, Southern Europe Division. I would like to express my gratitude to Eddie Lee, the organizer of Dharma Train, and also Vicky Bodhi of Buddhist Global Relief. However, he is not here with us tonight. So, let's move on. So, I can never express enough thanks to our moderator, Kathleen Moran. She's my dear friend, co-board member at UNA, and also co-chair of the Partnership for the Eradication of the Human Trafficking. I also want to express my sincerest gratitude to our distinguished speakers, Dorchen A, Cecil Noel, Ruth Hassel-Thompson. These ladies have put tremendous effort in fighting domestic violence in decades. Do you know that 7% of women in Canada suffer physical abuse at home? In Ethiopia and Peru, almost half of the women also are victims of domestic violence. In the States, every 1 out of 4 women and every 1 out of 7 men has been victims of severe domestic violence. Let's take a closer look to New York City. In 2016, the domestic violence hotline received more than 300,000 calls, which is about 22% jump since a year ago. Most of the victims are females, followed up by men, children, and transgenders. These numbers are very horrific. It means domestic violence can happen on any of us here, regardless of race, gender, or culture. When I was preparing for this panel, I feel so ignorant that I didn't know domestic violence is not limited to women. So we extended the invitation to the guy support groups and also the LGBTQ community. Domestic violence was first addressed at a UN conference in Copenhagen in 1980. UN condemned domestic violence as an intolerable offense to the dignity of human beings, as well as a grave problem for the physical and mental health of the family as well as society. Since then, UNA has been advocating domestic violence awareness to the community. I strongly hope when you live here tonight, you will take something from our panelists and feel confident to make an impact to the society. Just having a few handful of information, such as how to help, how to support, could be benefit to your friends, family, or anyone you love. Thank you very much. And let's give a big round of applause to Jenny O'Donnell, our PhD.
Thank you, Wayne. Welcome to all and attendance on this. The Buddhist Action Coalition, also known as the BAC, thanks with gratitude our panelist speakers for coming to educate us about this issue. Buddhist Action Coalition is an activist coalition of New York City Buddhists and surrounding areas. And we're dedicated to bringing Buddhist practices and principles in action in order to bring about true justice. Our mission is to organize and inspire compassionate Buddhist initiatives in advancing social, economic, and environmental justice for all beings, undertaken through advocacy of non-violent direct action. As Buddhists, we unequivocally reject individual, communal, and systemic violence in all forms. And in our practice, we acknowledge the inherent dignity of every person and being. And tonight we will learn from our panelists and also from the audience, because we prepared an extensive Q&A in which you can actively engage with the panelists at the end. We'd like to learn through this interaction between audience and panelists about the complexities of domestic violence and deepen our understanding about this issue on the micro and macro level, with the result of infusing our efforts and actions with knowledge about the social and political systems at work that contribute to domestic violence. And we recognize that to effectively address this issue, it's necessary on a personal level to acknowledge and examine our own biases that may contribute, and also our preconceptions. And in a larger context, to identify big picture patterns that uncover what's at the root of domestic violence and how it affects people. And we trust tonight that you can take home something. We also have resources at the desk. Please do take something you have in hand if you want to get involved on this issue on the ground and at a personal level. And to kick things off, I'd like to introduce the moderator for this evening, and that is Kathleen Moran, co-chair partnership for the Partnership for the Eradication of Human Trafficking, and board member of the United Nations Association of the USA Southern New York Division. Please give a gracious welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to let you know how the evening is going to proceed. I'm going to introduce the panel, then I'm going to be asking each of the panel members a few questions. They're each going to speak roughly 15-20 minutes each, so I ask that you hold any questions that you have until the end of when everybody's spoken, and jot down whatever you'd like to ask. And then we're going to have an extensive Q&A. It's going to be 30 minutes. And at that time, we're going to be passing the mic around. So wait for somebody from the coalition. I believe Adrian or one of the other members will be coming to you with the mic. And then we're going to have a question at the end as to which each of you can take home an action today to either help a survivor or support or help progress an act that a bill that we're going to be, Ruth Hassel-Thompson will be speaking about. So that's how the evening is going to proceed. So first I'd like to just introduce the panel to you. Excuse me. First we have Dorchen Leidholdt. She's the director of the Center for Battered Women's Legal Services at the Sanctuary for Families, and she is also the United Nations Champion of Change Award winner. Then we have Cecil Noel, the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office to End Domestic Violence and Gender-Based Violence. And then we have Ruth Hassel-Thompson, the Special Advisor for Policy and Community Affairs of New York State Homes and Community Renewal to the Governor Andrew Cuomo's office, and she's a former New York State Senator. She's also a board member of UNA USA Southern New York Division. So welcome. Thank you very much. So we'll start with Dorchen. Do you mind if I just use your first name?
Yeah, please call me Dorchen.
Okay. Dorchen, could you just tell us a little bit, first of all, about Sanctuary for Families? And go ahead, I'm sorry.
So happy to do that. Sanctuary for Families was founded in about 1984, 1985, so it was in the forefront of work to prevent domestic violence, to protect survivors in New York City. We started out very tiny and grassroots, and now we're a pretty large organization. I think we're the largest dedicated provider of holistic services to survivors of domestic violence and related forms of gender-based violence in New York City. And it's our belief that if we can address the multiplicity of urgent needs of domestic violence survivors and their children, we can help them move from danger and dependence to safety and independence. We can help them move from victims to survivors. So currently Sanctuary has, I guess you'd say, 4 major prongs. And one is we provide shelter every day, every night to about 200 survivors in New York City, and a safe place to live is just the foundation for survivors, and so many survivors don't live in safe homes. The second is we provide trauma-informed counseling that's uniquely designed for adults or for children. The third is legal services. I'm the director of the Center for Battered Women's Legal Services, and to my real shock, we now have just close to 50 full-time staff attorneys representing survivors in principally immigration, family law, housing, public benefits related matters, although often criminal issues are at the forefront of our work as well. And then I think one of our latest forms of recognition, and it's something that Commissioner Noel, by the way, it's such an honor to be on the panel with her and with Senator Hassel-Thompson, who have been just formidable leaders in this area for such a long time. But we've come to recognize that if we can't equip survivors with the economic tools they need, if we can't bring economic justice and empowerment to them, we're not going to be able to achieve our goals. So that's a central part of our mission at this point.
Excellent. And domestic violence has historically been understood as a trivial family problem that belongs behind closed doors and not in our criminal or civil justice systems. Historically, victims have been held responsible with the question, why does she stay? Does this misconception persist? And if so, how are you and other advocates working to combat them?
You know, sadly, I think misconceptions about domestic violence persist. And I think it's helpful to understand where they come from. You know, I teach domestic violence in the law at Columbia Law School, and I teach social workers, graduate social workers at the Silberman School of Social Work. So I go back and explore the history, and I just think a little historical snapshot can be helpful to understanding really where we've arrived at this point. But it also helps us understand that we have still have a lot of work to do. Really, until relatively recently, that it feels that way to me and to the other panelists. And as I'm looking around, I see folks in the room who may be looking at it from the same vantage point, those of us who might be in our 60s or 70s. And it doesn't seem so long ago, in the late 1970s and 80s, that was when things began to change. But before that time, domestic violence was either sanctioned by our legal system or completely ignored by it. And intimate partner abusers enjoyed complete impunity and victims zero protection. And as many of you may know, you've probably heard of the rule of thumb. How many people have heard of the rule of thumb? Oh, not so many. Well, it's important to understand that until the latter part of the 19th century, husbands were permitted to physically abuse. It was called discipline their wives. They were supposed to be disciplining them for disobedience, which meant that wives were legally obligated to obey their husbands. And this was sanctioned and upheld in court decisions. And I'll give you an example of one of them. This is from a court in North Carolina in 1864, but other court decisions are almost identical. And this court said husbands may use such a degree of force as is necessary, and no prosecution unless permanent injuries. Permanent injuries. You know, I know a good bit about New York State criminal law, and that would be a very serious felony level offense, a C felony, permanent injuries. And this right that husbands enjoyed, the right to physically abuse their wives, was called the right of chastisement. Now, it began to get whittled away and ultimately eliminated by advocates against domestic violence, advocates for women's rights in the 19th century. But it was replaced by a legal doctrine that continued this right. It was called the doctrine of domestic privacy, and it completely blocked abused women from bringing either criminal or civil actions against their abusers. And over again, you see in the court decisions through the 19th century, through the first several decades of the 20th century, judges over and over describing domestic violence as trivial. Sometimes they use the word trifling. I'll give you an example. This is a decision of a court. We will not inflict upon society the greater evil of raising the curtain upon domestic privacy to punish the lesser evil of trifling violence. And this law, the doctrine of domestic privacy, didn't begin to fall away until the 1980s. Honestly, when I used to be a criminal defense attorney, and I represented men accused of crimes of domestic violence. I did that for 6 years for the Legal Aid Society. Over and over again, I would hear the judges ask questions like, well, is the complaining witness married to the defendant? Does the complaining witness have a relationship to the defendant? And if the answer was yes, you could just see the judge respond, well, this isn't really such a serious case. And describes it, he calls it strategies of coercive control. That's Evan Stark. And he conceptualizes it as not isolated incidents, but as a pattern that deprives victims of their fundamental human rights, of their liberty. A second important concept, we began to understand that domestic violence is a pattern of control that often involves severe physical, sexual, and psychological abuse, but it often escalates. It typically tends to escalate and become more serious over time. And it's not about the actions of a particular individual victim. Abusers typically try to dominate and control any intimate partner they're involved with. And we see this at Sanctuary for Families. We watch women, usually, sometimes men, but predominantly women get safe, and we watch, sometimes we'll assist the second victim of the same perpetrator. We began to understand that domestic violence is deeply gendered. Doesn't mean that men can't be victims as well, but when men are victims, there's often a gender dynamic, but 80% of victims of intimate partner violence are female, and 70% of those killed by an intimate partner are female. And when it's a man being killed by an intimate partner, in many instances we learned that that intimate partner was a victim of domestic violence. And then finally, I think one of the most recent additions to our understanding of domestic violence, these are all evidence-based lessons, is that domestic violence too often escalates, becomes extremely dangerous, and even lethal. And I must say, at my time at Sanctuary for Families, tragically, I've witnessed the death of several domestic violence survivors we tried to assist. So those are tragedies that devastate them and their families and their communities. There is a very important researcher at Johns Hopkins University, a woman named Jacqueline Campbell, who has done a great deal of work in this area, and really she was prompted to do this work by the loss of a victim, the death of a victim that she had assisted. And she asked this question, is there any way that we might be able to identify those cases in which lethality is a very distinct possibility? And she's identified factors that help explain which domestic violence victims, survivors, are the greatest risk of an intimate partner homicide. Something that's important to know, and these connect with questions we ask every time we do an intake assessment at Sanctuary for Families. What are those factors? Is anybody familiar with the lethality, dangerousness factors? So these are the factors. Increase in severity or frequency of the violence, use of or threats to use weapons, threats to kill the partner, the children, and or the perpetrator himself or herself. People tend to act on threats, we're learning. Abuse of drugs or alcohol, stalking, choking, or forced sex, unemployment, and separation, relatively recent separation. These factors are constantly in mind when I'm working with a survivor. I interviewed a survivor over the weekend, and I chillingly heard multiple factors, and I communicated to her, I'm worried about your safety. So it's so interesting. You asked Kathy about that question, why does she stay? And you know, it's perplexing to me, but still I hear that posed over and over again. And what that question does is it shifts responsibility from the abuser to the victim. Well, we spend a lot of time, those of us who are in this business of assisting domestic violence survivors, of answering those questions. And I mean, there are really good reasons that victims stay with abusers. They are often economic in nature. They often have to do with children, trauma, lack of immigration status, and very often community pressure. Abusers make it very, very difficult for victims to leave. But I think one factor is very important for us to contemplate and for those connected with systems to contemplate, and that is separation. The point of separation is the time when it's most dangerous for domestic violence survivors. And once you fully appreciate that, you understand how extraordinarily difficult it is for domestic violence victims to extricate themselves from abusive relationships and move forward on that path to safety. So I think I'm going to stop here. And thank you so much, Kathy, for posing those important questions.
Thank you, Dorchen. I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions after this. Cecile, do you mind if I call you Cecile? I'm probably going to call Ruth Hassel-Thompson because I don't ever know her by anything. So thank you, Cecile. Can you please just tell us a little bit about the Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence? Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It really is a pleasure to be here with you this evening and to be on this panel, to be on the panel with Dorchen and Ruth Hassel-Thompson. It truly is an honor. I look forward to your questions. I look forward to the wonderful dialogue that we can have together. And I think how we've set the panel up is actually perfect because Dorchen really went into, I think, a lot of the dynamics of intimate partner violence, domestic violence, answered, I think, probably many questions that you might have in your head about why and what is it like and how do we define it. And I think that's so important. What I'd like to do is actually talk to you about the city, my office, and the overall city response and how Dorchen and I actually work together in so many ways to address this issue. So my office is the Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence, formerly known as the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. And we had a name change in September. The original office, the Office to Combat Domestic Violence, was established in 2001. And so we've had a lot of years as the Office to Combat Domestic Violence. And during that time, we've really built, I think, an office that is truly responsive on the larger city level to thinking about all of the issues that intersect and impact domestic violence victims across the city from multiple agencies. Any one domestic violence survivor will and can encounter at least six or seven different systems in order to get their issues resolved. And that's just a reality. It's a reality of how lots of places, not just New York City, is really set up in terms of you go to family court, you might need to go to criminal court, you might need to see an advocate, you might need to go into shelter, you might need to go on public assistance. There are just many, many systems that impact a survivor's life. And so my office, in essence, was established to really think about, on the larger level, all of those systems and how we can make it better and easier for survivors to access systems and get the services that they need. So currently, the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence is really leveraging all of the work that we did as the Office to Combat Domestic Violence to now address not only domestic violence, but to address sexual assault, stalking, trafficking, and family violence. We know that on the continuum of violence, domestic violence or intimate partner violence is just one component of the larger issue of intimate partner violence or gender violence, right? That bigger issue of gender violence. And how do we hold that? How do we really address that in a bigger way? How does the city really respond and be the leader that we always have been around these issues? So I'd like to point out a little bit of what our office is really doing. So at the core of what we do, we work on legislation, we work on policy, we work on prevention issues, outreach, and we also work on research. So I'd just like to give you just a little example, and we can go into more with the Q&A around some of the work that we've done. So on the legislation front, what have we done? Last year, we passed Paid Safe. Paid Safe was an expansion of New York City's paid sick leave law that really said that not only do individuals need to accrue time to address sick leave if they're sick and they come into work, but they also need to be able to use that time to address issues that might impact them on the gender violence spectrum. So what we did is we wrote legislation and it was signed into law by the mayor in 2017 that really expanded that to say if you have a victim in the workplace and they need to use that sick time, they can use the sick time to go see an advocate, to go into shelter, to move their child to a new school, anything that could fall along the continuum of what they might need to do to address that. We have the most expansive paid safe leave law in the country. It applies not only to intimate partner, it applies to sexual assault and trafficking victims as well. And more than that, we said that it also applies to if a family member is going through this and you need to use that. And we took the opportunity to say, it's the family that you decide, which opens that up to LGBTQ, transgender, and gender nonconforming individuals who have chosen family members, the family of your choosing, which might not always be your biological family for many of those individuals. So that's one way that we're moving legislation. I think Dorchen mentioned where we've come in terms of our law. So I said that we also do policy. So we work with NYPD very closely to be able to have them really step up to the plate and be responsive to survivors in new and better ways. It wasn't so long ago. And I think we can all remember when police responded, what did they say? Hey guy, why don't you take a walk around the block and cool off? Just take a walk around the block. No more. We have very aggressive laws around what we do in New York City. We also have trained domestic violence police officers. Where else in the country are you going to find a whole unit that really is dedicated to responding and training and really bringing all of what we know to be the appropriate responses to victims when they encounter them? So that's also really important. We do a lot of training. Our office trains other city agencies about how to respond to domestic violence survivors when they encounter them. So think about this. You have a survivor that's going into, let's say, public assistance because they need to apply for public assistance in order to have some resources to be able to leave. So we train public assistants, which we know is HRA, to be able to understand what survivors are going through so that they can appropriately help. We advocate within that big system for policies that will help survivors get what they need in the way that they might need it, along with the Department of Homeless Services and New York City Housing. We do lots of work and training so that not only are they understanding the experiences, but also responding appropriately, and that policies reflect that. Policies and how the employees in those systems really carry out that is equally important. So that's a lot of what we do. And we also do a lot of curriculum development. So we have all kinds of curriculum on how, and we train community-based organizations as well. How does intimate partner violence affect children? How does, how can we better respond to opioids? How can we better integrate that knowledge to help individuals with mental health? So we're constantly thinking about all of the intersections that our survivors have with many, many issues. So we have the curriculum development. We also do a huge amount of prevention. How are we ever going to stop this? It's all about prevention. It's all about young people. We've launched a huge piece that is about going out to young people where they are, talking to them about healthy behaviors, talking to them early about healthy behaviors. We started the Relationship Abuse Prevention Program that's now in 94 high schools, and we are expanding that to middle schools. We're going to 128 middle schools this year. That's already started, where we are teaching young people boundaries, what is consent, how to manage behaviors. Young people get so many messages from all over that are not healthy. And so this is a chance for us to have that kind of meaningful dialogue, engage with them in ways and really promote healthy behavior so they won't become victims, hopefully, and they won't become abusers in the end. So we do a huge amount of that. We have a research division, so if you go to our website, you will see that we do a lot of research. We have a lot of data, we do a lot of research. So we've done research, we have a fatality review that we examine every domestic violence fatality in the city. We've been doing that for many years, giving you profiles, thinking about what that looks like, but also using that to really help us implement better policies around what agencies are doing in all of those intersections. So we're doing that work. We've done it for intimate partner elder abuse. How do we look at that? Elders happen to be the largest growing segment of the population that we're seeing in our family justice centers, which I'll go into in a minute. And thinking about and now that we know that, how can we use that to inform our policies and our practices? Finally, the Family Justice Centers. The Family Justice Centers are what we see as our customer-facing piece of what we do. We have Family Justice Centers in every borough. So what's a Family Justice Center? Family Justice Center is really a collaborative, multidisciplinary environment where we are saying that, remember all those systems that I told you, survivor could go here and go here and go here? We bring as many of those systems under one roof as we can. So within a family justice center, we are co-located with the district attorney's office, so that should a survivor decide that they want to pursue prosecution, that element is right there. We have civil legal attorneys, Dorchen and her wonderful team work out of the family justice centers. We have immigration lawyers. We have mental health practitioners in the family justice centers. We provide children's counseling because it's not, it is about the survivor, but it really is about the whole family. And how can we, in fact, help those children who themselves may have experienced or seen violence in the home? How can we help them? There's counseling and advocacy, and wellness services, because not only do we have to help the survivor with the actual programming, we also need to help them heal and move on. And we have economic empowerment programs that we do out of these centers. So you see that the center itself is a rich area, a rich place in which the survivor can receive the services that they need. It's a holistic, trauma-informed, client-centered environment where we're saying we're going to start where the survivor is. We're going to help this survivor really access the services that they need within this space. And so that's just a summary of what we do.
That's terrific, absolutely terrific. But
If you want to learn about services, you can call the hotline, right, which is on the back of your program. You see the number there. It's 1-800-621-HOPE or 4673. You can also walk into a family justice center. So all of the services and things that I spoke about are completely free and confidential, and regardless of your immigration status, sexual orientation, we serve you within that space. So those family justice centers across the boroughs, you can walk right in and get services. You can also go online to nyc.gov/NYC-HOPE. And that's the new domestic violence portal that we launched last year. It is the first portal in the country that really has a wealth of domestic violence resources all in one place. You can search by the service that you're looking for. You can search by the community that you're in. You can even learn about the issues and how to help a friend. We define all of the issues. What is domestic violence? What do we do on prevention? What is consent? We really have wrapped it into what we feel is a comprehensive place for someone who's just looking for information to be able to access that information easily. And of course, you can always dial 311 and get connected to the domestic violence hotline as well.
one last question. Do you see a lot of domestic violence in the LGBTQ community?
Well, you know, the issue of domestic violence is underreported here. So we know that this is something, you know, victims feel a tremendous amount of shame. They feel very isolated. They're often very reluctant to report. And that's just across the board. And once you go further into specific communities, immigrant communities often feel, especially in this political environment, very, very reluctant to report. And the same thing is true about LGBTQ communities and gender non-conforming communities. That yes, and they experience this as well. And so what we really feel is important to understand is that everything that we advocate for, we ensure that there are providers there who understand this issue and can service a victim no matter their language or gender expression. So within our family justice centers, you will find providers who are very skilled in working with the LGBTQ and non-conforming, gender non-conforming communities. And that's very, very important to us. And so we believe that everyone should have access to the services as much as possible. And we work hard to create that environment.
Thank you so much. Ruth Hassel-Thompson, the Domestic Violence Survivor Justice Act. How did that come about?
Well, first, thank you. Good evening. April 9th on 2012, I stood in the building of John Jay College and introduced the Domestic Violence Survivors Justice Act. that was not the beginning, obviously, of the discussion and the hearings that we've had around the state to look at and examine a lot of the issues relating to domestic violence. I went into the Senate from local government in the year 2000, and there was no such thing as a task force or any real discussion around this subject. And so I was able to encourage leadership to create the task force. And of course, whenever you encourage something, you get to chair it. But that was a task that was not difficult for me to take on, primarily because before coming into the legislature, I had read about a case that many of you may be too young to remember, but it's the case of Jean Harris. Jean Harris was a teacher and the head of a private girls' school, and she had as a lover Dr. Tornow, who was quite famous. He wrote the South Beach Diet, and he was brilliant. And their relationship was very tumultuous, I guess is the best way that you could put it. But the danger of it was that Jean Harris became a problem to him. She became tiresome, and as relationships sometimes evolve, he no longer wanted to be in the relationship, but she was clinging to it, in part because she was addicted, and he was feeding her different types of drugs, and she was dependent, but she was also emotionally dependent upon him as well. And they had an awesome fight, and apparently she brought a gun to the scene and she killed him. The difficulty with this case in 1980 was that there was only the very beginnings of discussion and even language that talked about battered women. And it sounds interesting to know that historically, with this as in the at the levels to which it occurred, that there would not have been more understanding, but obviously there was not. You heard Dorchen talk about the fact that I would like not to say that courts sanctioned it, but the courts were silent because the courts were driven again by morality and by a lot of other different things that influence the way in which courts behave. And so it was considered okay by law, culturally, religiously. I mean, people could even go to their pastors, ministers, priests, and receive sanction. You know, you could for almost, the church was a sanctuary for everything except domestic violence. You were to cleave to your husband, and whatever he did or said was okay. So the tragedy of that is it left very little or no room for the kind of openness that needs to happen when problems arise. So Jean Harris's case always disturbed me, primarily because I never felt that she got a good trial, a justice trial, if you will, because there were no lawyers in Westchester County that would even touch this case. Again, Dr. Tornow, because of his popularity, was somebody that just absolutely she couldn't have gotten justice in New York. So she went to Bedford Prison. When I came to the Senate some years later, I was introduced to another case, the case of Deborah Fiegler. Deborah Pigler was from Los Angeles. She had, she was married to Oliver Wilson, a man who abused her, prostituted her, and sexually assaulted and abused her 6-year-old daughter. This dramatic case became the subject of a docudrama known as Crime After Crime. And it's very well named because continually the justice system committed crimes against Deborah Pigler over and over again. She went to jail for, she was charged with conspiracy and first-degree homicide. She was accused of having gotten the Crips and Bloods to get rid of her husband, and they said for the insurance. She should have gone to prison by state law in California for conspiracy for 6 years. She served 27 years. Her case continually came up for parole, and Wilson's family continued to come to each of the hearings, and she was constantly denied. Her case was heard finally. And the interesting thing is, over a 7-year period, there were 2 attorneys that were assigned to her case, and they were real estate attorneys. But their company was doing pro bono, and the only 2 attorneys that they could free up to work on this case happened to be in real estate law. But I can tell you that by the time they finished the 7-year stint, and they were only supposed to stay on the case for 2 years, but because they became so deeply involved with Deborah Pigler and her family and this case, and they saw the tremendous injustice on the part of the DA, who had never lost a case. And when you investigated why, you saw that he violated every law possible. This film is available, and I recommend it as one to see. It's 90 minutes long, but I will tell you that if you have a dry eye, that means that you need to examine your own humanity. Because as many times as I've seen it, it still continues to disturb me, because as someone who has been a policymaker for 25 years in elected office, it told me how poorly our justice system really does work. And why, if we are not engaged and involved as a society, horrible things happen to our people inside as well as outside of prison. The case of Jean Harris was not quite as horrific, because Jean survived Bedford. In fact, she taught some of the young women, and she was able to be quite a mentor and quite instrumental to many of the women who were in prison, and helped them to be able to make the kind of adjustments that they needed to make to go back into society. Deborah Pigler only lived 6 months after she was finally released from prison. She died of cancer. Her daughter, who was a 6-year-old that had been molested, was the one who continued to persist and fight her case. When her case came before the governor of the state of California, he refused to sign her release. But fortunately, the law says that if it goes to the governor's desk and he does not sign within 90 days, it automatically becomes law. That governor was Schwarzenegger. He refused to sign it, but she was finally released. These cases became the basis for conversations between me and the Women's Justice Center and the Women in Prison Coalition and several other groups of women who had formerly been incarcerated. And I was very pleased and very proud to be the person that they requested to to carry this bill in the state Senate. But not only did I help to draft and to push very hard and continue to advocate for the passage of this bill, but it also forced me to look at several levels of law. See, when you pass a law, you don't only change one law. In this case, you changed penal law and procedure law, and in some education laws, there are several laws that have to be adjusted and changed. And so when we were looking at some of the domestic violence bills that the State Assembly had attempted to pass in the past, some of them had been, pieces of them had been incorporated into other bills, but many of them became the basis of the language that we use to ultimately frame this language. What becomes important for those who are law and order people to understand is that this was not a get out of jail quick pass, but rather the criteria is very stringent, very specific, and it probably only affects 100 women or less, and today, fortunately, even fewer number because many have been released since the beginning of this bill in 2012. But not enough. There are still too many women who are doing extended sentences. And it is very interesting if you sit in the courts and watch how judges, when they don't have mandated sentences, and there were a lot of my colleagues who said that they thought that mandated sentences had merit. But I've always pushed for judges to have more flexibility and more leeway. But when I watched how some judges gave women stricter sentences than they did to men for lesser crimes, I almost had to change my hat. But because I truly believe that there are too many judges in our courts who are really good at what they do, and the beauty of it is, it was not an accident that I chose to be the ranking member on judiciary for 12 of the 16 years that I sat in the Senate for that reason. Because I wanted the opportunity to interrogate, and I do mean interrogate, everyone who was coming before us to go on the Supreme Court, and certainly on the Court of Appeals and on the highest court in the state of New York. And I needed to be sure, and a lot of my colleagues accused me of social engineering, and I said, I will wear any banner that you deem. But yes, I want to see the courts balanced, but the balancing is not only as much about gender, culture, but it's about compassion. And I look at the history of the work that judges have done before they come to this bench to see what is their thinking and what is their sentencing. And it takes a whole lot of work to go back and to look at. But those are things we must do, and we must do that when we're voting for judges. And as much as I am a party person, I subscribe to the fact that the only party that's important is the party of the people. And that what happens for people and how judges speak and talk and the kinds of questions and the way they answer questions when they are before judicial committees is very important to me, and it's very telling. And if we ever needed an example of how important that was, is those, worldwide people watched this last appointment. And it gave us a real sense of the power behind the people who pushed for those judicial candidates to get elected. And so it becomes important as the trickle-down effect really impacts how we look at the people that profess to serve us. And so these cases made even more important to me the quality of the work that we did, the hearings that we conducted, so that the language that we used in and of itself was constitutionally balanced, because you do not want to victimize either side in the court. And people say, well, what do you care? Well, I care a great deal about justice, because when justice is really served, no matter what the outcome, I can still go home and accept that we've done the best job that we can. Because that's what a free society really is supposed to be about. But I've got to be assured, that the language of what we choose and how we go about looking at these systems that we put in place is very, very important. And the people that you entrust to do that are very important as well. And so to tell you that these cases disturb me tremendously is an understatement. To watch women who are beaten and raped and who are prostituted and who are drugged and who are degraded to the nth degree. And because they fight back and because in some cases they do serious injury to the person who has abused them, has a moral implication. But in that moment, it's about survival. And so the question that you have to ask yourself as you advocate for the bill, should the courts be given the opportunity to review these cases in light of our enlightenment about what domestic...
Can you tell us what the status of the bill is right now?
I was kind of hoping we run out of quick time before you ask that question. There's a long answer to that question, and I appreciate if you just allow me to indulge me just a moment.
But sure, actually we have a little time because these two ladies were very kind, so we have some time.
When you are putting forth legislation, remember in the Senate there are 63 senators, and the majority of them on the opposite side from where I was sitting have prisons in their district. So that when you make your appeal and your approach to them, you have to do it with the understanding that increased sentencing means more money in those prisons. When I left the Senate, the young man that followed me, Jamal Bailey, wanted to take up the bill, but there was another senator from Queens who took the bill up first. And at first I was excited because it was a female and I thought that she'd do well with it. But she has allowed herself to be intimidated, so the bill has been somewhat eviscerated, her version. So I'm encouraging people to take a look at the original bill, which is the Senate bill, and take a look at the Assembly bill, because it continues to be the same bill from its origin. And Jeff Aubrey the sentencing was extreme. And it could allow then for the court to set aside the original sentence and do resentencing. It also, it makes the criteria, while stringent, because we were very careful not to be all over the place, because again, you want these bills to pass and you have to think inside the head of your opposition, what are the concerns that they're going to have? And beyond the concerns, obviously, of the prisons in their district, They want to be sure that public safety is not at risk. I know that you've been watching the case of the parolee who had killed a police officer and the brouhaha that occurred because the parole board finally released Thomas Bell. Well, Thomas Bell more than served minimum and close to maximum required by law. But there are people who just didn't want to see Thomas Bell get out of prison. And there will be people who will feel the same about some of these cases. And so when you look at the bills, you will see that some of the elements that make the original intent of the law truly palatable, as well as good justice, you will understand why I'm advocating that the original bill be the one that you support.
Thank you so much. We're going to actually go into the Q&A because I'm sure there's a lot of people that have a lot of questions. So I'm just going to ask that we have a little bit over half an hour now, but please be mindful of the time and mindful of your speech, which is in practice of which is in coercion or in line with the Buddhist practice. So we just ask you for that. I don't know who has the mic. Okay. So if you just want to raise your hand if you have, I'm sure you have questions. So.
Thank you so much. I'm going to keep it very short, but I'm here tonight in a dual role. I'm a marriage and family therapist. I had a practice in Connecticut, New Jersey for many years. I was married 15 years, walked in on my ex, having an affair, packed up, left it all behind. Met a charming man from Westchester County. 3 years I was with him, swept me off my feet, the most wonderful person. Simultaneously, I got a job in New York City, where I always wanted to be my whole life, in Brooklyn. This man he was an alcoholic. He became extraordinarily violent. Everything escalated. I was injured. I would go to the doctor. My only support system was my friends and family in Connecticut. My supervisor, who was also from this small town, apparently was having an affair with him, or he would rub that in my face every night. So when I say tortured, being kicked, it was horrific. What I want to say about New York City, you guys are above your game. I use all your services. He depleted my funds by destroying my vehicle. The list goes on and on and on. But what did I do? I went in my car and I called the hotline. Night after night after night. And they told me, keep calling and we will give you your own apartment with somebody. Sounded okay to me. I called 5 times a day and they said, okay, Queens. I said, I don't know much about that borough. Very inner city, something I wasn't used to. Every single thing, and I know I've called these offices before, everything you guys do is with warmth, love, support, and survival. I'm here tonight. My roommate, who I had, I'm out of the shelter. I now have to stay with a friend in New Jersey because I'm working with New Destiny, hopefully to get me in Brooklyn. New York City took me in. You didn't have to. I was Westchester. But because I wasn't safe there, I was taken here. And there were never any questions. And the entire process, Family Justice Center, everything you do it's unheard of. Being from New Jersey, people don't talk about it. Connecticut certainly doesn't. But every day of my life, I am thankful for what you guys do. And I'm also not embarrassed. I would tell people at work, and I noticed what you're saying. People don't know what to say. Suddenly, no one's your friend anymore. People walk away from you. Reporting that my boss was having an affair, and then there was an immigration issue. he admitted to using me for a green card. So I had to do the whole ICE thing. The man's going to court tomorrow again, has the finest lawyer in the world, and going into the justice component, his hand will be slapped and I'm sure he's gonna do a little community service or something. What internally helped me to survive was the injustice of this. They tried to get me to leave the job. They pretty much wanted to beat me down. He also said that he was gonna have me murdered and killed every day of my life, in my family. I checked the phone records. He was calling my mother at 2 o'clock in the morning. He was 90. So why do people stay? 2 reasons. For, I think the psychopath, finds who their victims very easily, empathetic, caring therapists. But you are always looking for that nice person again. And that's where I think the Stockholm Syndrome component comes in. It's 90% bad, but then the 10%. And of course, because the fear of acting on a threat. You guys are wonderful. I'm so glad I found you on the internet. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing.
Just a quick response. It's interesting that you say that about New Jersey, and yet New Jersey has passed this act. I sat on the panel with the daughter of Deborah Priegler at John Jay, and the attorneys were still out in California, so we Skyped them in for this panel. And as we continue to advocate, as I said, for passage of this bill, one of the senators from the state of New Jersey was a part of that panel, and the state of New Jersey has passed the Survivors Justice Act. The other comment was the workforce, in the workplace, the employers are required and responsible for the safety of their employees. And that's reportable.
I'm not surprised that you found it difficult to find resources elsewhere, and I just want to say you and those like you are the reasons we do the work that we do. It's very inspiring. It's funny, we talk a lot about vicarious trauma. Those of us who do this work day in, day out absorb a lot of trauma. But increasingly we're talking about vicarious resilience. And we get vicarious resilience from the resilient women, men, and children we work with. And so you just gave us a little jolt of vicarious resilience. Thank you so much. But I'm struck by just how fortunate we are. New York City is a fantastic city, and happily, there's still a resource shortage, but it is comparatively a resource-rich environment with so many organizations working together. But to me, the Family Justice Centers were the game changer, because prior to this, those of us who provide services have confidential locations, and sometimes it's not so easy to reach us. Anyone can walk into a family justice center and get the whole panoply of services, so it makes all of the difference in the world. New Jersey has some wonderful laws, that's absolutely true, but without the boots on the ground, the service provision across disciplines, domestic violence survivors are too often left without the assistance that they need.
In Connecticut, doesn't talk about it.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. Dorchen said it very well. It's very moving, and it's very empowering and impactful for those of us who do this work every day. And it gives me yet another reason to keep pounding on the door and say we need some more. So that's what I'm going to keep doing.
So my name is Erin Haysworth. I'm from the UK. I'm the chair of the National Alliance of Women's Organisations in the UK. So I have a number of questions. So in the UK, there's something called the postcode lottery. In other words, there's a disparity between police forces depending where you live. So I just wondered whether in the US, is there a zip code lottery? And where does the funding come from for the shelters? And are there sufficient spaces for all the DV and violence against women and girls survivors? And are there policies that move women from being to victims to survivors to protagonists and entrepreneurs, for example, so moving people across? The Family Justice Centre seems to be a really great example, and I just wondered if they're replicated elsewhere in the US. And also in Austria, there's a really good system, which is there's a complete dovetailing between the NGOs who do helplines, the legal system and the police. So when a call goes from the helpline, the survivor and the police go to the house and they escort the perpetrator out of the house, leaving the woman and the children in the home, rather than the women and children always being forced out to shelters. And then after that, the local judge has an injunction immediately so the man can't return and he has to go on violence training, anti-violence training. So I just wondered if there was a system like that in the US as well. Thank you.
Okay, you've asked many questions.
Yes.
So I'm going to start with that. You asked, I've written down about 4. I know, there are at least 6 I didn't get. So I'm going to ask you to help me like move through the pieces of the questions. All right, and we'll take them one by one. So I think the first one you asked was there zip code disparity between police officers responding? And in New York City, no, there isn't. All right, so in terms of precincts and response, the response is the same across the city. In terms of patrol and you're calling 911 and getting a response. I just want to say something that in addition to that patrol response, which is anyone can call 911 and they're going to get a response, in addition to that, New York City has yet another level of policing that's called the domestic violence police officers. So domestic violence police officers, especially trained officers, that can sometimes respond depending on the tour, but they are also there for community training and for follow-up on high-risk cases. So that if you are remaining in the home and this is a high-risk case, that domestic violence police officer is checking in on the home, checking in to see if the abuser has tried to come back, checking in to help and connect you to resources and connect you to services. So that's one. And so I'll stop there. Does anyone want to chime in on that one before we go to the next?
The further out of the city, however you go, the story is not quite as satisfying. There are still towns and villages where the police officers are not trained in the way that they are in New York City, and that is a part of job yet to be done. But if you're living in any of the boroughs, the plethora of services certainly do exist. But as I said, the further out of the city you go, the fewer and further between are those resources. And in some communities, they're more organized than in others.
You know, I just wanted to say another very important and thrilling development is our city domestic violence office expanding its mission to an array of forms of gender-based violence. And this is so important because we have made a lot of progress on domestic violence. There's no question about it, but Senator Hassel-Thompson, before this past Thursday, I went to Taconic Correctional Facility and spent that day interviewing domestic violence survivors who were serving decades because of really acting in their own defense in abuse. So there are areas where we have a lot of work to do. But I just wanted to say, and you mentioned prostituted women, and I was so happy that you did, because not infrequently, domestic violence takes a particularly pernicious form, and you could speak to that, Kathy, probably more than anyone in this room, and the form is human trafficking and sex trafficking in particular. In many, many instances, the trafficker has an intimate partner relationship with the victim, and so it's an extreme form of domestic violence. I say traffickers, and they're usually pimps or batterers on speed or amphetamines, and it is so severe, it is so toxic, and a condition that was alluded to. Some people I think you called it Stockholm Syndrome. It's often now called traumatic bonding, and it's when you're in a situation of severe, escalating, prolonged abuse, and they're alternated with times of apparent compassion and caring and reward. This condition, traumatic bonding, is instilled in victims. So this is a very tough form of domestic violence to address. I'm so happy, Commissioner Noel, that your office is taking this on. And this is not nirvana, New York City. We still have our work to do, and that's one area, because our wonderful New York City Police Department, horrifyingly, a group of officers in NYPD, actually in the human trafficking unit, were recently exposed as committing acts of trafficking and sex buying themselves. You know, we're planning a meeting with the police commissioner to talk about this, the kind of training that has happened force-wide around domestic violence. And accountability has to happen in the area of trafficking as well. So we do have our work cut out for us.
So now I want to tackle, I think you asked about shelter, correct? Was that the next one? So how is shelter paid for? So shelter is paid for by a combination of funding from the local government, city tax levy, state dollars, and federal dollars that fund each and every domestic violence shelter bed. We have the most expansive shelter system in the country. The numbers of domestic violence shelter beds are huge here. I think we're up to something like, as of tomorrow, maybe 58 or 59 shelters, right? Those are solely domestic violence shelters. Then we still have a system that is homeless, and that's separate. So when I talk about that, so think about it this way. There are approximately, across the system, almost 3,000 individuals living in domestic violence shelter in New York City, and that's separate and apart from the DHS system. Does anyone want to add?
I want to, and so the challenge, shelter is an urgent need. We are, I think, comparatively resource rich, but still there are not sufficient shelter spaces for every domestic violence survivor that needs a shelter. But I think the huge crisis that we're facing in New York City is our city generously provides domestic violence survivors in shelter with vouchers, with the goal, the hope that they can move to permanent housing. And the shelters are, the vouchers can be, let's say for a mother with 2 young children, close to $1,600 a month. So you would think that that might be adequate. But we now have a crisis because of what's happening in the real estate market in New York City, landlords feel that they can do better. Survivors who are trying to move from shelter to permanent housing are not able to use the vouchers, are stuck there, and sadly end up moving into the city's homeless shelter system, and then continue to live lives that are not confidential shelters, not the kind of stability they and their children need. This is a really serious problem, and it's not the fault of our city. Our city is taking the lead, but we have a problem here, Commissioner Noel.
Yeah. One of the issues, and I always sound like the sound of doom, but you know, after they do that, then I have to figure out how legislatively to fix it. So I have to always talk to you about what are some of the deficiencies. One of the concerns that is raised for me is that the shelter allowance is only good for 180 days, according to the law. And so that the question that I posed, and just let me go back a minute, indulge me again. I left the state senate in 2016 to go to work for the governor, and as you heard, I'm a special advisor for policy and community affairs. And even though I'm based in HCR, I am actually an advisor to the governor on an array of issues. But the concerns that the reason that I wanted to be based at HCR was this very problem. And that is, how do we create housing for vulnerable populations? And so we're not only looking at permanent housing for victims of domestic violence, but we're also looking for housing for homeless youth, those aging out of foster care. I mean, and then grandparents who are taking care of grandchildren. You can't bring children into senior housing per se, so that we have created only 4 in the country, 3 of which are in the state of New York. I'm very proud to say. And we're looking at how do we create more. But again, the real estate market, let me go back a little bit further back, roll the tape back. When we were doing the Domestic Violence Act, as I told you, there were several that had been on the books and they had not been able to pass. There were two very difficult ones that we were not successful in getting passed in the beginning. One was a non-discrimination in terms of housing, which disallowed landlords from discriminating against victims of domestic violence. If the police were called too many times, they would want to evict them. Number one. The other was in education, and those were two of the biggest stymies, and the two that are most critical to women in this situation is completing that education, because many times they go into relationships, put their education on hold, and then suddenly find themselves without the wherewithal, the education and the resources with which to take care of themselves. So when you're doing legislation, there's a whole big world out there that all has to be explored, because each of these issues has with it subtitles, if you will, that also have to be addressed. And housing and education were two of the biggest ones. And while we do have support, some counties, again, we've had to really push them hard to enforce the 180 days in shelters, because they've been trying to put them out after 90 days. And so, again, these are, the further out of New York you go, the more difficult it becomes to really be able to count on the array of services that may in fact be available in New York City.
So I just wanted to add two things. One, that the New York shelter system, domestic violence shelter system, is unique in that we not only have emergency shelters that you can stay for the 180 days, but we also have what's called tier 2s, which you can stay for a much longer period, which you can't find or really don't find anywhere else in the state. So what we really try to achieve is that once someone hits the 180 days, that we try to find space so we can move them into a domestic violence tier 2, which they can stay much longer and be able to support them through the transition to permanent housing. I will say this much on the housing front. I think according to HPD, New York City has a less than 5% vacancy rate. Right? So that's less than 5% for you or I that can probably pay fair market rates. When you then start to speak to low-income individuals, and the market that's available for them has been significantly reduced. As a New Yorker, born and raised, there are communities that I walk by now that I cannot afford to live in. All right, and we all see it. We all see it, right? I'm here. I've been doing this work a long time. In 2009, 2008, when we were leasing up domestic violence survivors from shelter, we were placing them in Bed-Stuy and Bushwick and areas that we still had available stock. That stock has all disappeared. It's all gone. That's just the reality. And this administration has been extremely aggressive about trying to get the vouchers out there, trying to do everything that we can do to put the resources in the hands of survivors. But again, the housing market itself is really unbalanced and not in the favor of low-income folks. But what we have done through our own Human Rights Commission is that we've passed the laws locally that said that you can't discriminate against domestic violence survivors, and that CCHR, which is our Human Rights Division, if they find out about that, will take that case. In addition, they've also passed another law that says that landlords can't discriminate against vouchers, which is what we send not only domestic violence survivors out with, we send low-income survivors out with. That's what we have, and that's how they can access the housing. And if we find out that they're discriminating because it's a voucher or because it's DV, our CCHR, Human Rights Commission, will take that case and bring a case against the landlords doing that, and we have been doing that. It's slow and it's smooth, but we are determined to make sure that landlords are held accountable in every way that we can.
And that is, I know that that is happening, but I must say the discrimination that's happening, it's happening now, it's systemic. Landlords are discriminating against domestic violence survivors with vouchers. Often they use a proxy justification where your credit isn't good enough. And it's very, very hard to identify because they don't say, I'm not giving you this apartment, even though you have a voucher that will cover the full cost of it because you're a domestic violence survivor. They come up with another reason, and there's so many people seeking these apartments that it's almost impossible to ferret out what's really going on. But we really, as a community, as a city, we have our work cut out for us.
So I just want to go back to your question. So we've dealt with the shelter, police, housing, and I just.
Moving women on to being protagonists.
Excuse me?
Moving women who've been victims to being more than victims, more than survivors.
So we have engaged in economic empowerment programs. In fact, Sanctuary for Families, sitting here, runs a wonderful EEP, it's Employment, Education and Employment Program, right? That really works with survivors from shelter and those not in shelter to help them really gain the skills that they can to be able to move into the employment market. We have been working on credit and counseling issues, which I think just as the survivor said, that's often a tool that abusers use. They make you sign documents you don't read and say, oh, it's gonna be fine. They take the taxes. You didn't even know your name was on the taxes. And they file fraudulent documents, they ruin credit, and then when you are going out either into the housing market or anywhere else, you find out what's been done to you. And so we've been working with organizations to help repair the credit, really build new credit. We've been working on entrepreneurial programs that are coming this at the beginning of next year. We're going to start with several entrepreneurial programs for survivors who may not have the ability to step into parts of the workforce that we think, but do have skills, marketable skills, and so we're helping them do that as well.
My sister's place and Hope's Door, which are two in Westchester County, have also begun to do the entrepreneurial training programs as well. That's one of the areas where we are doing better than in some of the other areas in terms of ensuring that those who come into the shelter don't go out as empty-handed as they come in.
So we've had two questions so far. So brief questions coming up. I have one here, and then we'll go over here.
I was in a situation where years ago I was about to be evicted, and I remember feeling powerless and hopeless. And I didn't take it out on, well, I did take it out on somebody myself. But I'm wondering, I think a lot of these men and women, that abuse also feel, is there any way that you can work with those people, or is the pathology too strong? I mean, the abusers, work with the abusers.
So I think it's a really important issue, and it's an issue that there are a lot of differences of opinion about. There are programs, domestic abuse intervention programs that have taken place all over the country. Batterers intervention programs, batterers accountability programs, they have different names. And there's been enormous research into them conducted really since the late 1980s when these programs first began to serve. They do not make a difference in terms of the incidence of recidivism. One of the best programs I know of was run by our sister organization, Safe Horizon, a batterers accountability program, 26 sessions over a period of many months, run by a man I just have so much admiration for. His name is Ted Bunch. And ultimately there was a very controlled research project that found that it really wasn't making a difference, and it led Ted to leave this program and found an organization called Call to Men. And he believes that it's really important for men to really engage in sort of peer awareness and accountability with other men. And this, as we affect this change societally, that's what's really needed to really change encouragement to stop abusive behavior. I'm pretty convinced that that's the best way to go. Resources are scarce, and I think we need to direct those scarce resources to the kind of programming that Commissioner Noel was talking about, and that is prevention programming directed at young people, especially going into communities before those patterns of power and control become entrenched and become, a central psychological dynamic. So I'm personally, based on this research, I'm not sure that we want to invest scarce resources into those kinds of programs. Others certainly may disagree, and I worry about programs that create, in my view, a sort of false equivalence between abusers and victims, and begin to talk about, when we start talking about trauma-informed batterers programs, that worries me. Certainly some abusers act because they've suffered traumatic experiences that's connected with their perpetration of abuse. Others act on the basis of power and privilege. And so I think we need to direct scarce resources where they're going to make the greatest difference. And I would personally really focus on getting victims safe so their children are not exposed to domestic violence, and really going into the schools and reaching young people with healthy relationship training.
I'm gonna disagree.
I was gonna say that this is something where we Dorchen and I love each other and respect each other tremendously, but maybe have a little different view on this. All right, so the city announced in April of this year an investment of over $3 million. All right, that's no small amount of money to really begin to look at abusers and abusive behaviors, right? So I think Dorchen, in one of her examples, gave a very telling example of a survivor that she worked with that managed to get safe only to have that same abuser go to someone else. All right, we really do need to address the behavior, and it is a behavior. It is a learned behavior. How, if it's learned because of trauma, if it's learned because of whatever this other situation, it is a learned behavior. And I feel hopeful. I wouldn't do this work every day if I didn't have hope for change, survivors change and move on and rebuild lives. And I am hopeful that as we engage in this programming and looking at creating curriculum different from what we've done before, because I think we've learned. I joined this movement 30 years ago. We look very different now than we did 30 years ago in terms of our interventions, how we think of this, even our work with survivors, right? We look very different. And so I think that we need to learn from the past, from programs that maybe were evaluated and were not successful. But we need to build on that, and we need to change. Putting survivors' wishes at the center of this conversation, their safety at the center, accountability, and working towards looking at what kind of programming we can create in communities that can really hold survivors accountable, that's not rooted necessarily in criminal justice. All right, many folks. When we look at the fatality report every year, I am consistently, amazed at how many survivors have died that never accessed the system, never went to a formal system, a government system, and not for profit. They've never gone, but yet still they are dead. But I can tell you that they probably reached out to maybe a clergy person or maybe, someone of their faith, right? And when those people are contacted, now they know that they could have called the police. They don't always want the father of their children arrested. They want behaviors to end. They want it to stop. They don't necessarily want to go down a criminal justice road, and up until now, that's all we've provided, really. So that in order to access an abusive partner intervention program, you gotta call 911, you have to file the police report, go get the order of protection. All of those things that have repercussions on families, and particularly in communities of color. right? Particularly in immigrant communities, they have serious repercussions and we need to recognize that. Now, I'm not saying criminal justice needs to exist and we need to make it the best system possible for those who choose to go down that road. But we also need to create options that survivors can access. If we are truly survivor-centered in what we do, we need to hear them and we need to be able to provide those options. And so we are engaging, the city is engaging in programming that can look at abusive behavior. How can we make that change? It will be rigorously evaluated. We will try to figure out who belongs in the program and who doesn't. Not everyone belongs there. And I'm here to tell you not everyone belongs there. But clearly there may be room in here to really engage with communities around other kinds of solutions to this issue.
I started my career as a nurse, and so everything that I view through what I call the lens of the therapeutic model. When we looked at Rockefeller drug reform, and I was a part of the team that changed that language, we looked at behaviors and we looked at the court system and who was being arrested, and we looked from beginning to end and looked over a 20-year span that law was on the books, and saw not only were we not addressing the issue by the punitive measures, but that the problem was continuing to escalate. Some of us got the bright idea that maybe we need to be looking at it therapeutically. And as we did that and created alternatives to incarceration, a requirement for treatment modalities to be made available with some of that money for those 12 prisons we closed, we then began to see a significant decrease in that type of crime. I subscribe to the thing that says to us that there is that short of a lobotomy, there has got to be some research that we begin to do on a scientific level that really looks at rage and looks at some of the underlying behaviors that exist. And while I'm certainly one who wants strong laws as you do, I also don't want us to lose a whole segment of our society because we haven't addressed the problem that for the person who is perpetrating this crime is in as much agony in their own way as is the victim. And again, a lot of my colleagues said, oh, you're so soft on crime. No, I just believe in being smart on crime. I believe in looking at the behavior and talking about what are the elements of that behavior that can be transformative and what parts of that behavior or where in that behavior can we intersect in order to change the way in which that behavior is affected, particularly as we talk about generational abuse and we talk about the systemic kinds of things that does happen in families because you were abused, it's the only thing that you know. And the reason that it's important, because too often young women will watch the behavior of their mothers and marry into the same kind of relationship because that's what they know. And so therefore there's something insidious about that kind of behavior that causes me to believe that there needs to be work done on intervention as well. And I know that the resources are limited, and I'm not suggesting that we take those resources that we've finally gotten dedicated. Because one of the things I've written down is for you to encourage the governor to put more money into some very specific types of things that we've talked about tonight. But certainly, I do not believe that we should ignore the fact that we ought to be doing some research on the pathology of violent behavior.
I'm sorry, if
If I could
somebody
just-
has one,
If I could
Please.
just respond,
Oh, sorry.
just very briefly. Oh, I totally agree that we need to break the cycle whenever possible, and we need to stop, there is an intergenerational transmission of domestic violence that we need to address. But I just want to say, we don't yet know. We don't have the remotest idea what works. And that's a problem, and a lot of research, I would love more than anyone to say, this approach, this Battered program makes a difference. We don't know
But you're
yet.
always talking programs, see,
But-
we're
but if I
talking
could just- but
programs,
if
and
I
I'm
could
not
just-
talking programs. I'm talking about scientific research. As we look at Alzheimer's, for instance, you look at what brain activity occurs that causes Alzheimer's.
Yes.
And there is a behavioral mind that is being researched that talks about the center of violence. And we're not researching that as much as we need to as we look at how that behavior plays out.
So research is really important, and I would love to see the research that helps us understand what can make a difference in terms of the perpetration of abusive behavior. But I think what those of us who are providing services to victims too often find, especially in the court context, is abusers who are getting therapy very often play the therapists, walk into the courtroom with a certificate of completion, we completed this program, and that becomes the basis for wanting custody of the children or wanting expansive visitation when it's really not safe. So I think that we have to be careful here, so that's my only concern.
And I'll just say that I hear the concerns, and as someone who has to not only advocate for and think about, one, I want you to leave with one important thing, that we are firmly standing behind the resources that we've allocated to programs. And so what we are doing here is not taking any resources from anywhere to be able to implement something. But I know that we have to learn, and we won't, if we don't try anything, we won't learn. We have to learn. And we have to understand, and it has to be rigorously evaluated. We have to look at what we did really well and what we did super poorly. And if we're holding survivors at the center of that and safety at the center of that, we'll be able to do that. We are embarking on a new frontier in thinking about things. We're looking at, is it better to keep the survivor in the home and put some services there and not whisk someone off to shelter? Because you know what? When you lose the apartment, you're done in this city. How can we revamp the system, retool it, have the system turn itself upside down, keep you safe, keep you in your community, not think about ways of severing you from your community, but helping your community to help be stronger and support you and achieve the safety. So we are looking at radical things, but you know what? I think the time has come. I think the time has come to really look at some of that. And some of it, we will get it right, and some we will learn from. We will learn from it. We will learn from it. So
I think the conversation that we're having right here is really a beginning of, again, expanding our horizons and looking into solutions, because everybody wants solutions. And that's where we can all say we want solutions. I'm sorry, but it's 5 to 9, and I have a question for all of you. If somebody has a and I'm talking like 1 minute question, because we have to wrap it up and be respectful of everybody. Okay.
In a happy coincidence, we are here to offer meditation in this beautiful Japanese Buddhist temple. We are here from the Bodhi Meditation Society, and we were so excited to get Jenny-san's invitation to come to this event. We offer free meditation sessions at our center in Queens, to which everyone is invited. But we also partner with organizations such as senior homes, assisted living, and community centers to offer meditation to people in need, in some cases high needs groups. And so I was just about jumping out of my skin. I so badly wanted to be able to share that with you, because we do have resources that we very much want to offer to this very important cause. And it's been such an inspiring night. And if anyone is interested, please see one of us. There are quite a few of us here. and we would be happy to talk to you.
Those of us who are affiliated with Buddhist groups, could we just raise our hands in case?
I just wanna thank you so much, thank you so much, that was such a perfect, that was just perfect. Perfect, absolutely
And
perfect.
it really was, and we found that meditation is one of the most valuable tools that we can offer survivors so often, even brief periods of meditation at a time when the heart is racing, in a stressful situation, in my experience, especially in the courtroom, when abusers and victims often come in close contact, it can make all the difference in the world, so thank you for offering that resource.
And I would love for you to talk to anyone who's willing to come to our family justice centers. If you've never been, I really would like you to see that environment, and we would love to take you up on the offer to be able to work with survivors in that space.
Meditation is good for mental age too.
So,
Systematically studied
do we have like 3 minutes? Do we have 3 minutes?
Can I ask that next time we have a panel like this, and I'm saying this because I was waiting all evening to hear it. I want to hear a topic about the veterans. I didn't hear anyone speak about PTSD, the domestic violence after coming home. As a veteran myself, I actually have a big tie to that. And knowing that I didn't hear that there's a big to-do with, we just lost 3 of our Ranger buddies to suicide because of partner domestic violence, partner connected. And it's a huge thing, and I didn't hear it at all as it relates to the centers, to the programs, and that type of thing. So there isn't an inclusivity that I'm looking for.
Can I just give just a brief thing on that? So Commissioner Sutton and I have met several times talking about the fact of the intersection and who are we seeing. We're actually collecting information now on our veterans. Sometimes veterans come in and they don't tell us that they're veterans necessarily. So we're improving our data collection. We're also improving the linkages with the services that Veterans Affairs really, or Veteran Services really has to offer to make better linkages. They have access to programs that we do, that mainstream survivors do not. And how can we access those programs in a better way, in a trauma-informed way, to help survivors? So I'm hoping that will grow in our collaboration, but we certainly are looking, one, to capture the information better at the front door so that we can make those connections, address the PTSD. We now have in every single family justice center a psychiatrist and a psychotherapist to work with families, right? To work with survivors in a trauma-informed way, as well as do medication management if we need to do that. And if this person's a veteran, we are actually working to connect them to veteran services as well. So if there's more that we could do, I'd love to hear from you, because I do meet with her and we do talk about what we want to do. We're doing training on the basis within New York City to try and improve their response and understanding around both domestic violence and broader gender-based violence.
Well, I run the Moral Injury Network team, which does those trainings.
Yes.
So I'm here.
Okay.
If you're open.
We are very open.
I mean, it's a political statement to say you're willing, but
we're
the more.
very open. We're very open.
Well, we need you.
Okay.
We need that representation.
Hey, this young lady's been waiting very patiently, and I know, just very briefly, we're already over time, but, go ahead.
All right, thank you. My name's Chloe. I'm a student at Bronxville High School in Westchester. And I was wondering how we can help address these systemic dominance and control issues that are foundationalized at such a young age, and how we can get involved.
Okay, so Westchester, why don't you answer for Westchester and I can tell you what my representative.
One of the things that I have encouraged in some of the school districts that I visited and been invited to talk to in Westchester have been around the peer-to-peer piece. About 3 years ago, when I was still very active with the Council on State Legislators, we were talking extensively about the kind of abuse that happens through cyberspace and how young people were being intimidated and the use of devices were being used as a form of violence as well. And I think that it's about a consciousness raising, but it really has to come peer to peer. Because you know, I have a 26-year-old granddaughter and a 13-year-old grandson, and I can talk to them, but when they're talking to each other, there's a whole different, it's not just the language, it's the body language and everything. And I think that we've got to give you the tools necessary to be able to do that among your student body and encourage young people to just talk to each other and provide the sounding boards so that you know what's going on. Because they're not going to tell parents, they're not going to tell institutions, but they talk to you. And you need to know the signs to be looking for so that you know the kinds of questions to ask to get the information. But the biggest thing that you don't want to do is to do anything radical that will that'll put them in further danger. But you do want them to know that there's a support system available to them. And there are people who will come and help you to begin the training so that you'll be able to do that and be successful.
Okay, so what I just wanted to let you know as well is that we have a significant academy, which are filled with young people. So it's young people talking to young people creating curriculum for young people. We hire them, we pay them, they go out into the communities, they go out into schools. This is what they do. And so, however, my office can be helpful in sharing that curriculum. Again, it's delivered by young people, facilitating trainings for you so that you can own that and go forward. We also have peer leadership. So not only are we employing people, we are developing in schools leadership to take the message, because that leadership is sitting at the lunchroom at the table, right? When all of this is going on sitting in the halls and in clubs and in other areas where our staff will never be, right? But they can carry that message, the message of understanding behaviors, calling out behaviors, resources, all of those things. And we do that across the city. We're doing it in high schools. We're now doing it in middle schools. And if I have my way, we'll be in elementary school very, very soon. But we're there. And that's really the curriculum. And it's also engaging parents. As a parent, when my 13-year-old, you know, in this age of electronics, I didn't know you could date and never see someone. I found that out. She had a boyfriend. I'm like, who is this? I've never met him. He's never called on the house phone. What do you mean? So we learn these things, and we often, as parents, are 10 steps behind. And so part of our job is to also educate parents to understand, but be able to dialogue with young people around these sometimes very difficult and uncomfortable issues for a 40-year-old. You know.
Some of the most powerful forms of education and transformation that I've seen for young people have been really tapping into the arts. And especially some programs like, I don't know if you've heard of Girl Be Heard or The Arts Effect, but they're really theater programs. They're brought into schools and brought into the spaces in which young people are active. And it's amazing because it really equips girls and boys with the tools they need to become peer educators. They're also incredibly fun, and they help them confront issues like cybersexual abuse, like sex trafficking that targets young people. So I think that it's very exciting thinking about bringing creativity and the arts into these kinds of environments. And then there have been wonderful comic book related vehicles. I don't know if you're familiar with a great organization called Freedom Ladder. Google Freedom Ladder online, and you'll see the coolest comic books that bring important information to young people, help young people strategize about how to be safe, and also have fun at the same time.
And you can go to our website and request a training at any point.
Okay, we're gonna have to wrap it up, and I just want to thank you so much for participating as an audience. It's really about you getting out there, knowing what domestic violence is,
and finding out information and knowing where you can tap into resources, because this is really what's important. So I just want to thank you so much for coming and wanting to learn about this issue. And of course to our marvelous panelists, and to the Buddhist Action Coalition, the Buddhist Center, and on that note, and to that lovely woman back there that you offered for services, and just wonderful. But on that note, I'd like to just, as a form of respect for the space that we're in, just have another minute of silence to clarify that, the evening, if that's okay. Thanks.
I just wanted to say thank you all for being here again. Again, my name is James Lynch, and I'm saying thank you again for being here on behalf of the Buddhist Action Coalition. Also, Buddhist Council in New York. I want to say we're creating a new culture of peace by doing these activities. We work together to create a new culture. So let's have a moment of silence, and we're going to chant the traditional Buddhist chant.
So James will once again ring the bell. We'll have a moment of silence, and then we will commence with a short, repetitive chant in the Buddhist tradition. It will repeat 3 times. Once the first repetition, you can listen to it if you're unfamiliar with it, and on the second and third repetitions, if you're familiar with it, please do chime in. And let us all hold in our minds all of people involved in the cycle of domestic violence, and pray and hope that we bring all resources and compassion to this issue. Gate, gate, para gate, parasam gate, bodhisattva. Gate, gate, para gate, parasam gate, bodhisattva. Gate, gate, para gate, parasam gate, bodhisattva. Please do stay and mingle and get familiar with the panelists and with each other. We have lots of resources in the room. Thank you for coming.